Welcome, everyone, and we are honored to have Governor Walz here with us today on this Yom Kippur. I want to put things into a little bit of context, but I got your CV off the internet, and I realized when you're the governor, you really don't need a CV, right? You don't really need much more. And so we're just going to have this really lovely conversation, and we feel so honored to have really the highest level of an elected official here this morning at Temple Israel. It is truly a gift, and we appreciate you taking your time. The Haftorah portion that we read this morning, if those of you who were at the late service, is from the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah tells us that this fast is not for us to like shy because we're not eating or drinking. This fast isn't about the physical fast alone, although we might be feeling it at about 4:30 or 5. That is a reality. But really, this fast is to propel us to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and provide shelter for the homeless, and to make sure that we raise up those who are in need. That's really what this fast is about. And so when I thought about the words of Isaiah, I thought that it's so important for us to hear what is happening in our state and to make sure that we at Temple Israel hear where we need to be, where we need to truly find our footing in this city and in this state, because we have a responsibility that we have always adhered to, and we're going to continue. And so this is a talk, not for a talk's sake, but to really find a way for us to increase the things that we do. Now, we are doing a lot. We do a lot around housing. We have become a sanctuary congregation and had a man here for 6 weeks who was going to be deported, became one of us as family. And when he left here out of his own decision, because it's hard to live in a place like this, he was picked up by ICE and is now back in Nigeria. And our hearts are with him because his entire family are citizens. And so they are all here. He was at the same job for 14 years, has been in this country for 40. So we are... These are the stories. These are the stories that we're talking about. So here is, and now we are helping a family from the south of the border, which is the thing that you hear the most about, and helping some children in another family get here because one of the children were left and we needed to pay to bring him, and helping them through a difficult time. That's what we are doing, and that is important, but so often it feels like not enough, right? We want to do more, and that's what we're here today. So Governor Walz, thank you, and you wanted to start with a few things, I think, and then I have a few questions, and then I know others will have questions, and you have cards, write them down as you go.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Zimmerman, and Ashana Tova to everyone. And
wow.
I am
wow.
grateful.
Let's just wow.
My second language is Chinese. When I was in the 80s, I lived there for several years, and my kids are so impressed I can order food. That's what I use it with now. That's all I get. That's the only thing. But I want to thank you first and foremost for the work that you and the folks assembled here in Temple Israel does. Such a deep tradition in Minnesota, a deep tradition in what we do. But you personally have been deeply engaged, from our transition teams to being engaged, what I think we called a One Minnesota inauguration, but it was an opportunity to highlight all of those wonderful diversity that Minnesota has. So to receive this invitation today, I'm really honored. Thank you for the privilege of being with you on the holy day. I am grateful for that. It's that Peggy Flanagan always talks about that it's interesting times in Minnesota, interesting way of saying things that we know. it's challenging, and I think these hard conversations have to be had. Something I get to do, one of the great privileges, and I know many of you have probably done it, but if you haven't, my pro tip of the day is to do this, is to go to a naturalization ceremony. I went yesterday down to River Center, 1,003 from 96 countries coming in there. I did it with Judge Fisher. Judge Fisher, really interesting story that he was born in England, I believe, and or his mother was, and his mother was put on a boat in 1943, and there were two of them that were children coming from England to the United States, and one was torpedoed and sunk, and those children died. His mother happened to be on the other one. And so, like so many of us, that was his American story, and it was so encouraging, and we end those ceremonies with all of the children coming forward and saying the Pledge of Allegiance together, and the sense of. So, again, I don't think it does us any good to avoid hard conversations. I don't think it does us any good to be falsely optimistic, but I think it does us a lot of good to recognize how many good things are still happening in the world, how many good things are still there, even in the midst of tragedies. We saw the news out of Germany this morning, and I think for someone like myself and for the state of Minnesota, the blissful ignorance to believe that that these types of things were historical rather than contemporary, and the idea that that people are surprised that anti-Semitism still lives are the ones who didn't know their history. So it's a pleasure for me to be here with you. I think there's really no way to talk about this. People ask me, how is it being governor of Minnesota? I don't have anything to compare that to. I have no. It's really weird that people are asking you about this job. But the one thing is, I think we approached it very much from the idea that the things we do collaboratively are the things that last. And we knew very early on where we were grounded, that when we talked about a One Minnesota, it wasn't this idea of a homogenous fake. Like I said yesterday, they take that oath of office, and it talks about renouncing all allegiance to foreign princes and leaders and things. It says nothing about renouncing your language, your culture, your history. In fact, it's just the opposite of that. I tell them this is now for you to embrace it even more and to have that sense of pride. We saw One Minnesota as being that, and it was a very unique opportunity, obviously, when the other half of my ticket, Peggy Flanagan, always says she has some really interesting thoughts about immigration, being a Native woman. That has its own implications. And so the issue of immigration, the issue of how we saw as a state, the issue that we wanted to see what we could do in Minnesota is all against a backdrop of, for some of us of a certain age, the most chaotic political time period of our lifetime, the most disruptive. And I say that of someone, and I think like many of you, I embrace change. I don't embrace chaos and anarchy, but I do embrace change. And I think here in Minnesota, the idea that we knew there was going to be policy proposals that were really mattered, and they tell you that if you're talking procedure, you're losing. I would disagree with that strongly. I felt that in this time that we're in now, and I thought about it when I was leaving Congress and coming back here, that Minnesota has something that's very unique. And Minnesota has had a tradition of making things work. And that doesn't mean that we don't have our issues. And again, we have a saying, when the conversation gets tough, Minnesotans say, oh, would you like some pie? And then we move on. Let's move on from that. It's race, religion, all of those things. We're not glossing over that, but we're making the case that we have some unique opportunities to tackle these things head on. And I think during this legislative session, I keep coming back to this. And there's legislators in this room who I would just like to say, there's so many people in this room. I can see them all over now that I have considered friends, mentors, and there's a tradition coming out of this temple of political, cultural, business leaders that are leading in there, and many of them are the role models that many of us have followed. So I think we'll get into a conversation about faith traditions and how that impacts us. I know one thing, as an elected leader, you certainly don't need me to give you a sermon, but you should perhaps expect me to try and live one. And I think when we put our administration together and started thinking about that, it was critical for us that before any decision was made, that how we went about building that team, how we went about talking about the process was going to probably in the long run, in the environment we're in, because it's the cards you draw, was going to be more important than the policies we put in place. And it proved to be pretty true, because it was a strange thing when people keep bringing it up, that of all 50 states, only one has a divided legislature. All other 49 states either have an all-Republican Senate and House or an all-Democratic Senate and House, except Minnesota. We were split.
Really?
And that sets up a dynamic that should have followed the national model of name-calling, posturing, self-righteousness, chaos, shutdown, frustration, disillusionment, and then this idea that, well, the next election's coming and we'll throw all the bums out. Good plan, but there's more bums coming. It's not just, that's not it. That we had to fundamentally change how we went about doing business, and that meant being very honest. It meant acknowledging, which isn't a big secret, but in this business it's very hard. I certainly don't have all the answers. I don't think people who voted for me expected me to know everything. I think they expected me to surround myself with people and reach out to communities that knew to try and get the best policies in place. And I think that desire of interaction, that desire of understanding that there are supremely skilled legislators already out there, and there's a responsibility for us to figure out how to bring them in. There are extremely engaged communities, because when I'm talking about homelessness, or we're going to move towards eliminating veterans homelessness and then childhood homelessness and move on, it makes sense to me to go out with Monica, who knows the names of everyone living in a tent under the bridge underneath the U.S. Bank. So I go with her because she knows. So when we go out on a summer night and take watermelons at midnight to set under the bridge to try and understand this, it was critical to understand the role of government was one seat at the table, not even necessarily the head seat many times, but to partner and leverage together to solve these social problems. So that's what we're trying to do. My 18-year-old, who's over at the University of Minnesota now, very clever, she said, "Dad, there's a real upside with you being bald and gray when you started this job. No one knows the toll that it's taking. Like with President Obama had dark hair and looked really young, and then he looked afterwards. She said, you look the same as when you started." I think she's right about that, but I also think one of the things that I have learned to do in this is that there's a whole lot of people shouldering the burden to make Minnesota a great place to live. There's a whole lot of people stepping up to do that, and I recognize the value and more than willing to try and partner together. So thank you for having me. Look forward to always being challenged in my thinking, being asked by Rabbi Zimmerman to approach things from a different way and to have a conversation with all of you. So thanks.
Perfect.
I feel bad.
I know.
I'll turn around here.
Yeah, we'll say hi to them.
Unless the question's hard from
I've
back
already apologized, so don't worry. So, so often people lose hope, and I think I have seen you in a number of places. Thank you for allowing me to have so many opportunities to do invocations at very important moments in the life of our state and in your life. And I'm wondering how you stay optimistic and hopeful. I've seen you in the legislature needing to say, okay, we are not going to play this game. How do you do that? How do you stay hopeful?
Well, some of you heard me say this. I say it only half jokingly, is that I am an optimist because I have to be, because I supervised the high school lunchroom for 20 years. Honest to goodness, I gave a kid the Heimlich choking on a Polish dog once, and I got assigned to the lunchroom every time. But I think it's like so many of us. I think I feel blessed that I was around a family of educators, and I think when you're in education, it truly is the future. You truly do feel hopeful. To look in the eyes of a child lets you see that there is that better day tomorrow, the potential for it. And I think like so many of us, the alternative just is not that pleasant. The idea, often, and Frank Hornstein could tell me this, we were in discussions at 3 a.m., and just the negativity and the bitterness, I said, you know, you impress me with your fortitude to continue to live in this state with how poorly it eventually is, or you think it is. This idea of just continuously to come down without the attitude some of these folks of saying, what can we do to make it better? And I think that hopefulness, and I think I would acknowledge, because I kind of struggle with this too, understanding how people have an optimistic attitude and what's the role of government to add that. Being a white middle-class person gives you a lot easier opportunity to be optimistic than living under a bridge in St. Paul. It becomes much more hard to be optimistic. So I think there's a responsibility for those of us who are in a place to do that, to continue to make sure that we're putting things into perspective and to bring that optimism. Not a, you know, we've those of us who are Gopher football fans have seen that. Oh man, we're going to the Rose Bowl next year. No, we're not. So just 8 wins would be good enough, you know. It's not a false hope optimism. It's, as my wife says, we did not think we'd have children. We were obviously older. This is where the gray hair thing, I have a 12-year-old, which really surprises people. When I go out to, like, we're getting ice cream down the street, and the person never fails to say to my son, Gus, oh, Grandpa's taking you out to eat. My son goes, just go with it, Dad, just go with it. So, but of trying to get out there and make that case of what we can do to inspire and bring people in. So I think that's where it comes from. I just can't imagine a world where it's not there, but I don't think we sell people on that false hope. And again, with those children, it took us a long time to have them. When we finally had my daughter, a minor miracle, and thanks for the Mayo Clinic and everything, my wife named her Hope. And I think that was part of it too. But my wife is really good about keeping this optimism grounded in pragmatism. She said, hope is the most powerful word in the universe, but it is not a plan. So you don't get off saying you hope we'll end homelessness. You hope we will bring fairness to the system. You have a responsibility to go beyond the optimism and actually make it operational. And I think that's what I try and do. And that classroom time probably had something to do with that.
Great. You know, I remember the book, I Learned Everything in Kindergarten, right? And so I'm wondering, what are some of the values? We hear hope, we hear taking things in stride, but are there other things you learned in the classroom that really are a part of your leadership today? Are there additional things?
Yeah, and again, I feel very blessed to have been in a family, and I think about this. I grew up Catholic, in a very Catholic family. My mom and everybody went to Catholic school. Every generation had a priest, so there were 8 boys in my generation of that, and each family was hoping. And thank goodness my mom didn't have a plan with that. It was just hope to be a priest. But I grew up in that Catholic tradition, and strangely enough, I never knew it at the time, because you're shaped by your faith tradition. So I'm in a small Catholic congregation out in western Nebraska Sandhills, and as it turns out years later, the priest who was there was deeply grounded and came from liberation theology background. So I learned very early on, don't you for a minute think that you're better than someone else. Don't you think that someone who's in crisis can't be you in a minute. And that sense of service that came out of that, it was servant leadership. And I think that helped ground it. But I think in the classroom, it was always, you're trying to get your lesson right, you're trying to deliver it. I oftentimes say this too. The first day I went in the classroom, I knew everything. The second day I knew nothing, and I spent 20 years trying to get it back. But the lessons that those lessons that those kids would teach you, and I think seeing that, and it was even more reinforced, I think I had it more reinforced with my kids, that each and every one of those unique individuals was the absolute love of the life and sunshine of the day for those parents that were there, but that life wasn't quite coming the same way. I remember just how simple things can go off the rails. I had a young woman who was I taught geography, and it was a big enough school, there were several geography teachers, and this student went to the counselor and was trying to shift into my 8th hour geography class from another teacher's 1st hour. And the counselors, were like, why do you want to do that? These are full. Do you just think it's easier over there? What are you trying to do? And this student was being somewhat evasive, said, I just want to switch. I just want to go to 8th-hour class. And they weren't letting him. And the student finally came in one time after school and just broke down crying. She said, okay, my dad is an alcoholic. He lost his license, and I drive him to work every morning. So there, are you happy? I can't come to first hour. And I think the lessons you learn in that is understanding every moment of every life and what someone's going through, to be receptive to that they are still trying to make all the right decisions, to all the right things. So I think those were some of those things. But that early grounding, and I guess I'm a wayward Catholic. Now my wife got me over to the Lutherans, which she
Which
said.
for us is the same.
Yeah, she said, that's what she says to me, and she says, well, how is it different? I said, it's pretty much the same, except you sing every verse of every song when you're a Lutheran. The Catholics just do the first one, so move on. But I think that's
great. That's great. I'm also, you talked about the tradition you grew up in and the one that your family observes today. And I'm wondering what you think the religious community's role in policy and in our state should be. And are we living up to our responsibility in that? Are we a place at the table? Are we somehow in a different place? Where are we?
Yeah, this challenges me because being a secular society, but understanding you can't separate your beliefs and your values, I talk about even a budget. A budget is not just a fiscal document, it's a moral document. It's a reflection of what you care about. It's a reflection of what you make important and how you're going to put that into policy that impacts people's lives. And so I've struggled with this, and I have the opportunity. This is another fact that maybe some of you wouldn't know. Those of you who know Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, she's a deeply spiritual, deeply religious person, and has connections to a lot of people. So she led me, and I've become friends with Jim Walz as we talked about this, and of course the Christian writer, the thinker in this.
Yeah.
His latest book is Christ in Crisis, and he talks about a member of Congress in 2017 asking 81% of evangelicals are okay with where we're headed. They're okay, not a political party, but an ideology. And the person, asked him, how can this be? And he didn't attribute it in there. And I'm thinking it might have been me. If it wasn't me, I was thinking the exact same thing when he would come in and we would talk, because I'm trying to wonder. I could not wrap my mind around prosperity doctrine. I could not wrap my mind around budgets that were deeply cutting into programs that made a difference. And I say that not because I felt that someone didn't care. I'm trying to understand what the faith traditions can teach us about how did we get to that point. And my biggest challenge is how to see someone else's perspective on this, and to claim that you are deeply spiritual and deeply religious and espouse policies that don't appear to be there. I want to know how that is, and then question my own self. Am I espousing things that run into that? The obvious ones are the moral issues that we may all struggle with that seem very obvious. Some of them are more subtle. And so I would say, I think now more than ever, the sense of how do we rise up? And it is not mutually exclusive. It is not without religion in its entirety. It's the organized religion piece of this. It didn't tell us to leave our morals, values, and beliefs there, and many of them are so universal that now more than ever. And I think we partnered early on and continue to partner with the faith communities because of the work that's already being done that so closely aligns with where we're at, making sure alleviation of poverty, suffering, access to health care, some of those types of things that are millennial old in each of our traditions. So I think now that there is a role, there is a place at the table, but I think it's, in many cases now especially, it's going to have to be driven by communities of faith, because I'm not telling you anything new. The faith in institutions across the board is absolutely, they don't want to believe the press. We don't believe financial institutions. They certainly don't believe elected officials. And even faith is under that. You know what the numbers are showing, organized religion and the numbers. And every few years, the Star Tribune will show these empty Lutheran churches out on the prairie as congregations are shrinking or aging. But I can tell you this, I see it even in my kids, the young people. They're searching for something. I think all of us know as you get a little older, that sense of what is bigger, what's out there, what are the things we should be doing are being asked. And having actively engaged congregations, actively engaged temple involved, it lets us have those hard conversations, because the race questions, the anti-Semitism, here's a fact for you. Minnesota has issued less pardons than Mississippi from our prisons. I think we think of ourselves that. We have the greatest disparities in racial disparities, in home ownership, in educational attainment and achievement, and social determinants of health. This is the state where you will live to be the longest and the healthiest if you're white. And so those are conversations that are very, very difficult in a polarized political environment to get there, and we have to find some of those commonalities. And it's really hard too, because you may ask, or we may get to this, in politics right now, it's even more, there's more of a risk electorally to reach across and compromise. And we're seeing, this Greek tragedy play out in front of us for tomorrow night, just in Minnesota. And it's that is dominating our discussion while the bombs are flying in northern Syria. Why, the human catastrophe of refugees is now approaching post-World War II, and as climate changes, there's going to be more people in transition. So I would say the role is even more needed. I think it's going to have to be building these coalitions. And I know these are folks, I've seen you, Rabbi Zimmerman, and we've had it before with multiple faith traditions of getting out there. We just have to stick with it. We have to just keep pushing it.
Yeah. So Jim Walz and I were on NPR, and I had the privilege of interviewing him through the Westminster Town Hall Forum. So he's amazing.
He's amazing.
He's amazing. He's evangelical Christian. It started Sojourner magazine. Unbelievable theologian. Very interesting, powerful. So
yeah, and I think I was
to learn from.
Introduced to him through Lieutenant Governor Flanagan,
Yeah.
and they are dear friends. And so I think he's asking. He is certainly asking and answering. He's got 8 questions. What the Christ in crisis, and that's how he's framing the discussion.
Right. As an evangelical Christian, that makes sense. So I am thinking about some of the legislation that's coming up. I know, just maybe, simply that there might be a hate crimes bill, that there's some things that the Jewish community should be really interested in. And sometimes we don't know that we should be interested in it until it's too late. And I also know that when we don't stand up and make our voices heard, that really elected officials can't do anything, as sometimes it's too late that citizens step up. So maybe you can give us a little warning what you might know.
Well, I'm gonna backfill that, because I get it. And again, for some of you who don't know, I am from Nebraska. I met a wonderful young English teacher when I was early in my career, who was from Ivanhoe, Minnesota. And I had just come back from China, where I was teaching, and my wife was from Ivanhoe, Minnesota, and of course said, "Tim, you did your Peace Corps time in China, and I did mine in Nebraska. Let's get back to Minnesota and get back." So I came to this state as an adult. I came to this state, I knew my wife and my in-laws. I came to this state of having no political pedigree and certainly no money, but with a belief, and saw that this state had the capacity to make differences. It resonated throughout the Midwest. It was different, especially if you were a teacher. And I was one with no intention of going into electoral politics. And all of a sudden, things just started to happen. And I've used this analogy. People say, oh, you were in Congress for 12 years. Is it like that show House of Cards? Nope. It's like Forrest Gump. Things just happen. All of a sudden, I'm standing there, and something's happening, and people are bringing it up. And the belief is, you think about this. People in Minnesota elected the high school teacher down the block to go to Congress and then to be 41st governor. And the idea that you can make the difference, and I'm not saying this because it was a whole lot of people whose shoulders I rode on. I'm telling you of now being on this side of the table that voices of the public do matter. There's a lot of things aligned against you, but I'm telling you, if we're getting lots of cards and lots of phone calls, people are paying attention, and we're trying to get out and listen to people. And so the idea, if a piece of legislation as it's put out, and we're not going to dodge away from some of these things. I mean, just think of the moment we're in and some of the irony. There was a piece of legislation that was pushed a few years ago that was meant to have people using their First Amendment rights to protest would be billed for police presence. Irony is dead in this country right now, if you don't see what's happening here. And I think there's a desire to craft some of these, and I think there will be one, especially in, and again, not denying it, anti-Semitism is risen again. And for some of you, I went to a JCRC banquet and mentioned this education piece of this. I did my graduate work in genocide studies, and I was one of the first 50 Balfour Fellows to the Holocaust Museum before it opened. They took one teacher from each of the 50 states and took us and talked about it. Because here's the deal, it wouldn't surprise you. Even then, in 1993, when we were doing polling and things, our students in this country can tell you about the Holocaust, but it's in a context of an anomaly in history. And they can write it off to a few monsters, and they can move on. And we were not getting to that banality of evil. We were not getting that it's with us constantly. We were not getting at the idea of, if you really mean never again, then you have to work on the front end and change something different. So we're teaching Holocaust studies in history classes rather than seeing them as currently where we're at in a political and a social context. So I think, again, you're going to see us lean into some of these. They are very difficult. We are leaning, and I want to give applause to both the legislature, and I'm going to single out John Harrington and our Attorney General Keith Ellison are out there dealing with police relations and police shootings, especially in communities of color. And we're trying to get a grasp to have these hard conversations. And so what I could tell all of you is it does matter if you organize together. It does matter if you're speaking and backing these things up. And it does matter if we continue to build. We have to solve these hardest problems, build almost those counterintuitive coalitions if we don't. When I was trying to figure out how to get medicinal, not recreational, medicinal cannabis into the system with the VA, I was getting huge resistance from my Republican colleagues until I got the commander of the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign War to stand with me, and then all of a sudden, like, oh yeah, we're on board. If the, do these things, go out and find different partners in this. And I think when we're crafting hate crime legislation, again, not to lump it together, not to trivialize, not to make the case, and you hear it all the time, and I'm sure the pain and anguish that you hear when everything is now a Holocaust, everything is now this, or the diminishing of this or whatever. We have to be very careful and very specific in our language. And I think for me, and I know there may be some legislation coming on this, I'm really focusing on the education piece of this, and I'm going to wrap it into too, and not shy away from the discussions last year. The entire budget was nearly derailed because people were going to cut the Historical Society's budget because we decided to make sure that when we talked about Fort Snelling at Bdote, it recognized the historical nature of those who were there first. And so those things are going to come back again, not because I have a desire to fight things that seem to be, again, if you live Lake on Bademakaska, you know these things can get into these really weird places, but these are conversations that are deeper and have to happen. We're going to bring them forward again, not, again, those who say, well, don't bring some of those controversial things forward and focus on the roads. No, we can multitask. We can do several things. We can figure out how to do that. But I think now more than ever, faith community is going to have to lead those conversations because there's just too much polarization for us to do it alone.
So just a plug for the AG's office. The AG is going to be here at Temple. Look in your programs. And along with legislator Frank Hornstein and JCRC and others, JCA, will be here to talk about, to get communal reaction to the forming of a potential legislation. So that's happening here in just a few weeks.
And if I could say, for those who are longtime watchers of state government, the Attorney General and myself meet every week. Those who have watched us for a long time, I heard that gasp from some of you out there. I thought that was always happening. It was not necessarily it. And I think there is a sense of this idea of building our power together, talking about things together, and learning from one another. So with the Attorney General coming, I would encourage you to take part in that, because that office and that structure is going to be at the forefront of some of these. And you see them out there. They're in the middle of a litigation now where hate speech is not free speech and discriminatory speech is not free speech. And I will defend to the end of time free speech. But the Supreme Court in the past has, and I think we as a society have ruled, there are limits to that. And if you do not put those on there, the outcome is, of course, discrimination, violence, and the things that follow.
Perfect. So I think I'm going to turn it to the group.
Great.
Yeah, you have to hold it up here, because yeah, at the top. 'Cause it's-
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much, Governor. I tried to take some of the questions in the room and organize them by cluster. Our first cluster is about education, so perhaps you'll bear with me as I try to link a few of these together. We've had people note that we have both great schools performing successfully and schools that are not performing well, and noting that some of the challenges outside the classroom may also affect the performance of the schools themselves, and are curious about changing that balance. Another question is particularly around the roles of gangs downtown that may or may not be directly related to young people and education, but wanted to bring it to there. And together with these questions is also one person expressed a concern that students might be encouraged to leave schools in a way, perhaps leaving more funding for fewer students when students leave school. I don't know much about that myself, but maybe you can say more if that's a thing and what that is. And finally, could you say a little more about arts and how we fund the arts in education?
Yeah, and the education, obviously, as a teacher, and I come at it from that perspective as a parent, but as a legislator, we made a top priority, and some asked, that we made a value statement as a mission statement for our administration that Minnesota would be the best state for a child to grow up in. And some said, well, what if we don't have children or whatever? I'm pretty convinced that if we're doing well by our children, everything else works pretty well. And if we're doing well by our indigenous children, by our communities of color, we're fixing a lot of the things that need to be done. Now, there's big things that we need to do. We need to make sure we get more teachers who look like these kids and culturally competent in front of them. We need to do that. There are things that we need to do, as you mentioned, Rabbi, outside of this, I know this as a teacher. That child who comes to school because they had to take their father to work because they couldn't drive themselves, or that worse yet, that child who slept in a car the night before because they're homeless, you don't really care much about geography if that's where you're at. So tying our agencies together, I announced our education commissioner, housing commissioner, and commissioner of corrections on the same day. That wasn't by lack of planning. It was because it's an understanding. The corrections issue is a social issue that starts on the front end. And for each and every one of you, even if there's not a moral imperative to get this right, there should be an economic imperative. It's a lot cheaper to put a kid on a little yellow school bus to pre-K than it is on the green bus to Stillwater. And that has societal consequences that cost a long ways out. So those are some of the things that we're starting to think about. But I can tell you this too is, there are those little things that make the difference. That to see this as too big a problem, we're approaching these by taking the state agencies and trying to break down some of those silos. And when we talked about this idea, all too often, if it becomes unattainable, every student's going to graduate from Minnesota. And I believe that if you do not set it and set a plan to actually get there, it does become a weakening of the objectives. It does become squishy in what you're trying to get to, and it becomes easy to say we do have the best public schools in the country if you're white. We have some of the worst outcomes if you're not. And so I think setting, like we did for veterans homelessness, for example, we set that goal that we are going to eliminate veterans homelessness. And I start, just to be candid with you, I feel a deeper sense of responsibility, but it is not out of a false patriotism or a jingoism, but I also am very practical on this. It's easier to get support around reducing veterans homelessness than it is of someone who doesn't have that, or whatever you might be. And and that's not a bad thing to say about him, it's just the reality of where they're focusing. One of the things we've done there is we're using our data capture ability with the VA and setting cross-agency plans. That number has dropped from 1,491 to 176. I know where every one of them are. And it's building resiliency in that there will be some that will come into the system. And we say eliminating veterans homelessness, which means it's no longer than 30 days and they're put in long-term placement that keeps them off the street for 9 months or more. So we are able to align those resources, align the different agencies, attack the problem, and get to where we are going to reach functional zero within months, I would say. And again, not setting a time because it's about getting it right. We're going to apply that to children, and we're going to apply some of those things. The same thing with education. As far as the money goes, you do need to fund education, but I want to be very clear about this. We need to be able to show outcomes. We need to be able to show results. I am not afraid as a public school teacher to compete against anyone else, but I also recognize that we take every single child. You don't run a school like a business. Some of you have heard that analogy. If you're running a blueberry business and you're shipping blueberries, the first thing you do is shake out the ones that aren't so great. Well, that's not how public school works. We're not shaking out the ones who don't do well. We're not going to shake out the ones who don't score well on the test. We're going to have to understand that those blueberries need a little extra time. They need some more help. They need something else. We're going to try and get that. And I don't think it makes sense to funnel precious resources away, but I'm also not afraid of trying something new. So those who make the connection or make the statement that we just want to protect the status quo that's not working, that's not true at all. But there are certain things that we can show with data are making a difference. And I'm forgetting what the other one was. What was that middle question?
The arts.
The arts.
There's
Oh.
the one about the arts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen this deeply in, this would go, I would argue, the arts are special, the activities that go with it, outdoors, even bike lane types of things. These are not nice to have things you fund after everything else. Those are the things that make us human. And the idea of what enhances life, both from a personal, spiritual, artistic standpoint, but to be very honest, I was just in Japan and in South Korea. Minneapolis and Minnesota looks different, and it's just not us with a false sense of pride talking to these folks. I was there with the governors of Indiana, the governor of Ohio, the governor of Wisconsin, and the governor of Nebraska, and we're all kind of making our pitch of why our state should be where you land. And the Japanese were coming back to us talking about things like this. The art and culture scene is rich. They care about that. The ability to invest. There is a sense of corporate responsibility coming out of the business community that shows an ethic both into philanthropy towards individuals and philanthropy towards the arts and other things. So we are committed to making sure that the state stays actively engaged. We're committed to making sure it's a piece of what our communities look like. And again, not just a theater district in Minneapolis or St. Paul, but making sure that every student, because this is the problem we're running into, both how we fund, back to your question on education, the Minnesota Miracle, and there was a lot of things to call it that. I know when you look retrospectively, you're kind of, it's all roses and not the warts that went with it, but there was a lot of good things happen. Two things they really did is they had equitable education funding that wasn't so determinant on these bond referendums and property tax. Because the problem, some of you read the New York Times story on Worthington, And I'm going to attest to this. I represented the city of Worthington. It is one of the best communities in this state, and one disgruntled bus driver does not speak for an entire community in that story. So all of you know that. But one of the problems we have is that school now and the main street is full. But the businesses look different than they did 50 years ago. They're ethnic businesses. There's 49 different languages spoke in the Worthington schools. They are busting at the seams with kids in Worthington. The problem is the funding's not keeping pace, so they're dependent on bond referendums. So they see bond referendums in some of the Twin Cities suburbs that build these beautiful domed football fields with climbing walls. They're trying to get classrooms that can have chairs in them to seat these kids, and it's causing a massive rift because the state's not keeping up with their equitable education funding that guarantees them by the Constitution a quality education and does not make them so dependent on property tax. Because this rips communities apart. You have older agricultural producers who love their community deeply, but wonder why they're footing a bigger part of the bill. The legislature started to correct that a few years ago. We did some more with it last year, but it still causes problems. And so that's one we're going to have to fix and make sure that in all corners of the state, because this desire, and they love the, I mean, the worst thing that I think in politics that happened, whoever the graphic person on TV about 18 years ago who came up with the blue and red maps, and it pains me as a geography teacher to explain what an equal area map would look like, or when you show it based on actual human beings and not physical land, that it is not so divided and it is much more a tapestry interspersed. And so same thing in terms of our funding, same things in how we view quality of life issues across the state.
Perfect. All right.
That's a great transition. There's a set of questions about health and wellness, both from the level of the individual toward communities. One person raised a question of when they see someone who, even though it sounds like they're waiting for a ride, but just kind of looking at them, it seems like they might be in need of help. What's the first step? Kind of how do we handle that? Two of the other issues that were raised specifically are asking about your own experience, knowing people who have been affected directly by opioid addiction, and responding to that crisis, and also how we as faith communities might respond to healthcare issues. One in particular that was called out was the crisis in getting insulin affordable or free of charge.
Yeah, I'll go backwards on this, try and remember the insulin piece. Again, I try and have these conversations. The legislators are here. Frank and I have had these before with folks, that it's really important that you start out with statements of values and shared values, and then I think work backward into the plan of how to get there. And I will not allow a healthcare discussion to happen before affirming everybody in the room to say that I simply believe healthcare is a basic human right and we have a responsibility to try and deliver it. And that'll stop a lot of conversations, unfortunately. And then you can ask the question, so what should we do with the person who shows up at the emergency room? What should we do? Because it's going to cost one way or another, or you can say no. I'm not going to live in a society that says no, and I think we need to be very clear about that. When it comes to insulin, and you need this, again, they'll make the case, oh, you want to give away free things? No, I don't. I'm not talking about giving you a new TV. I'm talking about giving you insulin so you don't die on the street. And I think we need to figure out how to best deliver that. This is a broader issue of healthcare, cost transparency. We've been having this discussion basically since the 60s and Medicaid and Medicare, and we go through fits and starts. But when it comes to insulin, we know what it's manufactured, we know what the cost of it is. We need to make sure that there is a plan put in place. The Democratic House came up with a plan earlier in the year. It does what it's supposed to do. It would make sure that everyone had that emergency supply, and it would start to look at price transparency down the road. The Republican plan came back, does some good things in there too about trying to get at this. The mechanisms are slightly different, and it's the pay for of this, of who should pay for it. Should the taxpayers pay for it, or should the manufacturers pay for it? Because we've had all these agreements. The free market is a wonderful thing, but we've always had bumpers in place. We've always had usury laws. We don't allow you to charge 400% interest. Well, at least we're not supposed to, but payday lenders do some, but it does happen. So there are bumpers in there. This is one, and you see society forcing this issue. Have you noticed the manufacturers have reduced the cost, the insurance companies are now starting to pay for it? That's all good, and I'll accept that. But here's where you've got a breakdown of this. This is clearly an opportunity to compromise on one, and they have two pieces of legislation. And those of us who remember the little cartoon, I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill, which is a total lie on how it really works, but they showed us that every Saturday morning for those of us of a certain age. They should conference those two things and get together to get that done. Because we saw what happened. It took us a year to do it. And I will have to tell you, before the session started last year, I had the chief financial officers, the CEOs of all the major manufacturers of opioids, and said, we are going to do this. You are going to pay in the end to help us fix this. We can do this as partners. You are not tobacco, but you're awful close to it, and you get to make the decision. Are you going to hire more lobbyists? Are you going to go to war with us? Are you going to try and find a compromise to get this done? And they went on and on. I said, I got to be honest with you. I think repairing your image is going to cost you more than $20 million, so I think this is a good deal. They went with it, and they went on along and did it. And I do say, I have to be very careful about this and being somewhat facetious. I don't want to ascribe worse motives to people. And these pharmaceutical companies that are and opioids, I've seen it with friends in the military. I've seen it with people with severe pain. They provide comfort to people in times. They are powerful tools that can be a positive influence. But they were recklessly administered. I remember in 2007, I did a floor speech. I was doing a step pain management plan for the VA. In 2007, as a member of the VA committee, I said, before we issue a single opioid, there should be a plan in place of how they will come off these, on what day they'll come off these, what do the dosages look like, how are we going to ensure this happens. That was implemented. And you know who was bringing that forward? People like Boston Scientific and some of these pharmaceutical companies. Now, I said in 2007 in a floor speech, if we don't get a handle on this, we're going to have an opioid epidemic that's going to sweep across this country. It wasn't because I was really could see the future on that. It was right in front of us already. It should have been solved. So for me, I've had friends lose their children over this. I, on this one, feel, but by the grace of God goes me. I went in a while back and had a knee surgery done, had really great physician. They gave me those painkillers. I didn't need them the next day. I have a 12-year-old and a 17-year-old in the house. It also came with this packet that I poured them in, put water in, and it neutralized it, and I threw it away safely so it doesn't get into the drinking water. So those were things the legislature did. There's things that are moving forward. I think that's what we can do. Now, asking about what you do with an individual, these are always tough. We have to do a better job. I'll use the veteran example again. There are 40,000 nonprofits that are there supposedly to serve veterans and families. The vast majority of them are actually legitimate. They're not scams. The problem is there's no alignment. There's duplication where it doesn't need to be, and where state government can partner with both nonprofit, private sector to try and do some alignment. That's the thing with those who tell you, and I just think you have to follow your heart on these things. Have you ever heard the people tell you, well, you can't just give people on the street money or food, and there's programs out there that'll help them, they'll abuse that or whatever. I kind of think if somebody's hungry on the spot, probably wouldn't help, and if they're going to go do something and buy a pack of cigarettes with it, that may be it, but in a pretty tough life, that might be not the worst part of the day type of thing. So I get it from that part, but we have to be more deliberate in how we tackle these things. And I would tell you, the folks working around homelessness and security in homes are smart. They are very intentional about what they're doing, and I think we need to think the same way. I am so fatigued of having a healthcare discussion that is not a healthcare discussion, it's an insurance discussion. I am so fatigued on talking about communities. It's fascinating. A community, you would not think of this, New Ulm. Some of you, National Geographic a few years ago said it's the least ethnically diverse city, over 10,000 in America. And that's true. And so that has its issues, but it also has a plus side. It's a great cohort for a longitudinal study on heart disease. because everybody looks the same and has the same background on that. New Ulm had really high instance of heart disease, so they put in something called Heart of New Ulm, and they collectively as a community together, they started changing how they advertise food on the end caps of the supermarket. The schools started working on healthy things. They started to have challenges. They had me over there as a member of Congress, way too much overweight, and said, all right, I got to get on board on this. And of course, obsessively compulsive me, I end up running marathon after that because I just got to, but it was all part of that community. Fast forward, significantly statistically reduced the number of heart disease, increased quality of life and life expectancy, and reduced healthcare spending by 23% in there. That's how you save money, because let's be honest, the state of West Virginia is now 43% of their children have childhood obesity. Good luck paying for that. You can't. You just can't. And so our take in Minnesota is moving on to that wellness piece, getting into that space of incentivizing wellness, looking on the front end of the research that can be done there, and not dwelling, and we always get sucked back into this, paying it on the back end after it's too late. It's too expensive, too hard.
Perfect.
I think I got all those that you had there.
I think you did. I think you got it.
Even, I was told to talk a little louder. Even though many Jews resonate with a lot of her progressive politics, the past year has been a particular challenge, as Representative Ilhan Omar has seemed to have fallen short time and again in using the language of anti-Semitic tropes. While it may be unreasonable to expect to agree with every elected official on every single issue, it seems like Representative Omar has been uniquely challenging for the Jewish community, even when so many of us appreciate the ways in which she's called out the White House for racism and xenophobia. So, what now?
You save the easy ones, so.
Yeah, I guess so.
No, and I this is exactly what I'm talking about, though. We have to have hard conversations. We have to have hard conversations, especially in places like this. I don't think it comes back to the all being human, and I do bring it back to this place. I see some of these. My halfway joke about House of Cards versus Forrest Gump, a lot of things in this country are done out of ignorance. They're done out of a sense of this. And I said, there is a white Protestant or Catholic privilege that comes with thinking that these things aren't around. And some of these anti-Semitic tropes are used just in common language that people aren't thinking about how hurtful they are, think what language means. I think, again, I would go back to this, I think we do a terrible job in our schools now of teaching both societal impacts of Holocaust, but on a broader scale of hate crimes. And how do you deal with those? And I think this is a situation where I think we see these, if I remember this right, the Chinese word for crisis is made up of one, danger, and opportunity. And when they're together, it's crisis. And that may be a myth, but it's a great story, so I'm sticking with it. So I can't write Chinese very well, but so I don't say it lightly on this. I think it is a dangerous time. I think it is a challenging time for our children who are here. You can't shield them from the news on Pittsburgh. They will hear about Germany. It steals their childhood. But I think the broader educational discussion on this, and I think in this case, as a representative, I know I have failed you before. I know I have, I tell my constituents that, but I want to see it as an opportunity to step forward. And I think having a powerful voice, a member of Congress who is uniquely positioned, that again, we have to resist that temptation. This is really hard because I understand I've got supporters that want me to just bash on the other side one way or another, and depending on where your ideology is, you want it to go both ways. I have a rule on this is that I will not normalize those things that shouldn't be normal, and I will call out those things that need to be called out, but I think there's also a responsibility to try to provide a path back or try to provide an educational opportunity or try and get in front of this. Because I've had to, I mean, I'm learning all the, when you grow up, of not being in temple, not seeing everything. I spent a lot of time on the campaign trail on Fridays being in mosques and listening and hearing the fears. And then this year in In May, we did something that had never been done in Minnesota. We did an iftar in the backyard of the governor's residence. And that was something in the middle of St. Paul that hadn't been done to try and make this. And there was a gentleman left, he said, I've lived in Minnesota 21 years. I feel like I'm home. And understanding where these cases are, and they're tough. So on this particular issue, I certainly don't dictate to other legislators or tell them, but I think to see these opportunities, and I think there's a real sense of power in this moment for elected officials to do what is basically unthinkable, to say, you know what, I am wrong, I am sorry, what can I do to do this? And I think there's a real power that goes with that because it happens in our daily life. I think there's asking, this was a good segue, I guess, for today, asking for that forgiveness, asking for that atonement, and these are opportunities that can be more powerful afterwards. And we just have to be incredibly careful, though. There is such a desire to burn things down and then move on, whatever it might be, rather than to try and come back at it. So I'm committed here in Minnesota that we're going to have these hard conversations. Some of you followed this. My wife does a lot with prison reform, and she got in the middle of an issue on race, and it's just not going to be hard. But as I've told her, I said I expect her to get right back in there and to continue to have these conversations. And I think this is one where I think there's much. I'm very hopeful on this, and I think we're going to need that. But I'm just grateful again that people are still engaging in the conversation rather than being so cynical that we step totally out of it.
Thanks for sharing the microphone. It's very gracious. A few people had questions about gun violence, gun control laws, the particular way in which gun violence from police affects young men of color, and also asking questions about what we as citizens can do to improve all of that, whether it's gun violence or racism.
Yeah. Let me go back. I actually missed one of those questions earlier, the issue of violence in Minneapolis and the issue of young people in gangs. Because I want to be very clear. Many of you saw a viral video that went out. One act of violence is too much. Now, statistically, this is still probably the safest city in the country. And statistically, it's trending down dramatically. At no point in American history has violence actually been lower. Now, I say that not as a dodge. That's little comfort to families that are victims of this. It's little comfort to live in St. Paul. To be very honest, I'm from Mankato. And to see this ramp up, it's very different. So that concern is real. And I think, again, the language we use as elected officials, the language we use as a broader community, does have something to do with that. I don't think you get off the hook by creating situations that allow that, not to dismiss the perpetrator, but to understand what we go after. Now, the issue on guns. I refuse to believe that there is something inherently wrong with the people of this nation that we kill each other at a greater rate than anybody else. When I went to Japan here a month ago, I went to a country of 130 million people that had 3 deaths by gun last year. The same day, 4 people got killed in St. Paul. Day. So I start from that perspective. I also start from the perspective of someone, I spent 24 years in the military. I have shot every gun imaginable. I have owned guns since I was 13 years old growing up on a farm. I did not use it a lot in my primary campaign, but I won the congressional shoot 3 years in a row in Congress. I was the best shot in Congress. But I also would never leave a firearm unlocked. I would never expect to buy one without doing a background check. And I would be remiss if I didn't see the data that if you are a man between the ages of 19 and 60 in Minnesota, one of the top ways that you will die is suicide by firearm. And to understand that we are asking for things like red flag laws where families can intervene and help in a time of crisis. And in states that have it, this is what we have to talk about, true statistics. They do make a difference and they reduce the incidence of suicide. Background checks. And for those who this all or nothing, well, that's not going to stop. No, I'm not naive. Many of these weapons are purchased legally. But we have to start trending in a direction where this all or nothing mentality and trying to understand in a society to put this, that the activities that you do would not be infringed by any of this, but it is a political litmus test now. And I've been on both sides of this. I've represented rural areas where owning guns and owning firearms was just what they did, but that world is different now. I tell people not to like, oh, look how this was. When I was going to high school, we put our shotguns in our football lockers to go hunting afterwards. That's not the world we live in today, and we can lament about the change, but it's the reality of this. And now, my 7th grader is well versed in active shooter drills. I cannot believe that's not changing his psychology. I told my daughter this, three things that I never worried about growing up. I never worried about a shooter in my school. I never worried about climate change affecting life on the planet, and I never worried about paying for college. Not because we were wealthy, it's because you could afford to go to a state school very, very cheaply. We have now transferred all 3 of those things to high levels of stress on there. My daughter is way too versed on how much more it costs now to go to college than it did in 1982 than she needs to be. And the fact of the matter is, we are investing less as a society than we have at any time in the last 50 years on our students. So.
Let's keep going.
You're giving me all my segues. Another question that, that a few people asked was about climate change. A few people asked specifically about particular concrete climate plans at the state level. And one person also made the observation that, and we'll see if we have time for a question about immigration, but made the observation that if there's this tension between federal law and the actions of federal agents moving people toward deportation, and states or cities choosing not to actively be partners in enforcing those laws, is there also a risk of that happening, for other kinds of things? What if gun legislation evolved in a way federally? What if climate change evolved federally? Could states be, God forbid, exempt from following law on that?
On that last one, we'll find out, because the Trump administration is suing California over what the Clean Air Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon. I find the need to say that often. The world has changed. It's a science. I'm a geography teacher on this. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've watched this issue evolve, and I think looking at the data, I wasn't certainly convinced in the early 1980s that at that point in time on the early end of this, that it was. The preponderance, no, the data is clear. Climate change is happening. You find the need to say that. Now, how do we address and think about this? Because the implications on displacement of people are going to be dramatic on what's going to happen. Folks who are going to be forced into smaller and small areas, folks are going to move, because there really is something about this. The immigration piece of this, one of the things is people that are forced into forced migration, either because of social unrest or climate. A lot of it comes back to that piece of it. And so I came back and left Congress. I was honored to do it. I felt like I could make a difference there, but I was convinced that the dysfunction at the federal level was going to force many of these decisions, both healthcare, climate change, gun legislation, back to the states. Now, the thing that baffles me is folks who have made the ideology central to their political beliefs that states' rights matter, apparently only if you agree with them. And then you will want to come in and overturn them, back to that piece of legislation that wanted protesters to pay for their protests. Well, how do you not justify what's going to happen tomorrow as part of that? You at least stay consistent. I think here in the state of Minnesota, the need to move forward both from a environmental standpoint, a social responsibility standpoint, but an economic standpoint is to make sure that we're well positioned. The markets, there's reasons that Target's going to reduce carbon emission. There's a reason that the ads you see on TV by XL Energy that's mirroring the plan we put forward, total removal of carbon from our energy power generation system by 2050, in moving towards that direction. And then us in Minnesota becoming the 15th state to say we're going to set the high standards that force that change. We're fighting with these people who think it's a sense of freedom to use incandescent light bulbs over LED just because they can. Just because we can, and you're taking away our freedom. we as a society have to agree on certain things together that it makes sense if it both environmentally and economically sound, which we're starting to see, move in that direction. And federally, it is going to be tied into the ideological fights that happen. We need to make progress. Now, I am not naive. The state of Minnesota reducing its carbon emissions to zero by 2050 and moving to the clean car standards in what we're going to remove about 8% of the carbon, the biggest move the state of Minnesota has ever done. Yes, that's a small piece of the global picture, but it moves in the right direction, but it also makes us economically competitive of people, and especially young people, who are demanding where they buy those things, where they get those things from. Because I think to disconnect your words from your actions are pretty hard. I don't think you can sell protest shirts in support of a union that are non-union made and made in Honduras. That's just what I'm going to say on that. I think that there's a sense of you're disconnecting your words from your action. You're disconnecting where you're going. And here in Minnesota, and I'm very clear that I understand, and this puts me in a little bit of a disadvantage with folks who want to move even faster. There's going to have to be a glide path. We need to have baseload power. So we're not going to leave carbon-based fuels or nuclear power tomorrow. But we need to have a plan in place of how we get there as quickly as possible. And then I think we have to start talking mitigation. Now, I'll just confess to all of you, that optimism in me comes back, and I have to guard against it, that I still believe that we can science our way out of this thing with carbon capture, and we can start to not hit that 2 to 3% Celsius increase that would be catastrophic. I think I say that, my son asked me, he says, that's the 17th time you've watched The Martian. I know, because we can science, those of you who've seen it, we can science our way out of this thing. I'm hopeful in that, but you know what? I'm not just hopeful, I think we have the plan. We have the greatest research institutions working towards that. We're going to have to incentivize the idea that this is real and we can move forward. And I recognize, to be clear, that we can't disregard communities who can't have this because, again, folks aren't going to be able to afford. This is why the move on clean cars is such a big deal. We're actually going to force the cost down on low emission and zero emission vehicles where regular, folks who are in middle class can buy them. Because not everybody can buy a Tesla S, but they may be able to buy a Ford, Fusion that comes down, and some of those start to happen. So we're committed to it. We think those are concrete steps. I think the Minnesota Clean Cars goes in the right way. The question that ties back to you, the Trump administration believes that it's been held up in court time after time again. We're not talking fuel efficiency standard, we're talking emissions. The law, the Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Supreme Court decisions have given those rights to the states, and I'm simply implementing them in that direction.
I want one more, and then
You were all patient. I've taught school long enough. I see that 1,000-mile stare. This is where my fourth grade students would stand up and turn around, stretch out, and so we'll go quickly.
So I noticed there were a few specific words of thank you here, so maybe I should read them and then ask the last question. One particular word of thank you was for One Minnesota, and just kind of a question about what it's like to be in a situation for you personally, given how polarized our society and our politicians have been. And another word of thank you is back toward your allusion to the JCRC dinner and the appreciation of the talk that you gave that night, the really inspirational words that yielded a standing ovation in that context. The final questions here are mostly about immigration. Can we help our state stop increasing ICE detention centers? Shelburne County Jail was called out in particular. What kinds of things could we do to accept refugees and immigrants more? And I'm going to turn around this last note into the context here, which is as we think about the balance between political involvement and deferred tax status, which I'm taking as kind of like the 501c3 organizations or religious organizations. How is it that we not only as individuals but as religious, as faith tradition-based communities can do this work in a way that's appropriate and stays in the right place in terms of politics?
Yeah, and I think those laws around that, and we know this is always a challenge in endorsing candidates from the pulpit, if you will, is certainly not there. But I have talked to people a lot of times on this where they say, oh, I'm so sick of it, I'm just not into politics. My answer to that is too bad, it's into you. So there's nothing, you can pretend and you can step away, but I think it's to be clear is there's a clear difference between politics and partisanship. And advocating for positions based on your faith traditions is something that for many of us is not a choice. You have to do that. And I think that intersection with electoral politics just makes good sense. And in asking for this, it is the weirdest thing in the world. Asking about being governor, but I also think that I feel blessed and things go for a reason of why they happen, that I think now more than ever, just having, and I say this, that I've had people do this to me like disdainfully, well, you're just a teacher, which is of course a great badge of honor for me to have. Someone actually did this the first time I was running. Well, you're a teacher, I'm sure you're a nice guy, but this is a really complex job. What are you gonna do, for example, if you have to deal with China? And I got to answer in Chinese when my staff said, who set that lady up? I said, no, I don't think she was one of ours. It was really real. But to do this, I know what my responsibility is, and there's a real sense in this, and this is hard, of respecting all those differences of opinions. And this issue on immigration, knowing that we're all immigrants, knowing that we care, and I know this just baffles me when folks lead with that they're a Christian, and then tell me why we need to keep these people out, and you want to connect A to B to the biblical stories, but I think there's a responsibility on any of these issues, whether it's climate change, to not just be, I talk about as a teacher, Maslow's hierarchy. Self-actualization is nice, but people are worried about the bills. The thing that's happening with clean energy is it's cheaper to use solar and wind, and they'll use it. Because what they want to do is they want to do the right thing, but they want to open up their bill and make sure they can pay for it, and they want to turn on the lights and have them come on. Once those three things align, they'll be all with us. I believe that the vast majority of people in this country are decent and care about immigrants in plight. We need to make sure, and this is where we blew it a few years ago, and we were very close in Congress. This is where we need comprehensive immigration reform, because people simplify this and say, people should get in line and do it the right way. You're absolutely right. The problem is there's no line, and there's no ability to do it the right way. So we should really be focusing on that piece of that, of understanding, celebrating that tradition. When you go to these naturalization ceremonies, they're incredibly powerful on that, and I think our neighbors would find them incredibly powerful, and I think they truly believe it, but maybe they make themselves feel better saying, well, that's the type of immigration I want, not that other kind or whatever. So I really think putting our focus on comprehensive reform, making the case on this, and then telling the true stories, that if there's a ledger sheet on this, the ledger sheet skews way heavy to the benefits of immigration versus the negative, and use Maslow's hierarchy to tell them why your property tax is cheaper, why this is here, and not allow them to say somebody's taking your job. Because I can tell you, the folks down at Hormel will tell you there's not a whole big line of people wanting to cut hogs down there at Hormel all the time. The people who do it, it's hard work, it's dangerous work, but it's work like in my family. That was the first generation of my family, that's what they did for a living. And then my dad, Korean War veteran, used the GI Bill, and then our generation. As far as us, again, this is a dangerous situation. I say dangerous in terms of I truly believe that that rule of law starts to come under some threat when we start to see this differentiation between federal, and I think objective truth is now debatable amongst folks. But when it comes to that, the state of Minnesota, in the position I've said is that we will do all we can to protect our people who are here. We will do what's necessary to ensure that we live up to our values. And I am not going to, and we are not partnering with, actively making the situation worse if there is not a plan to understand what comprehensive immigration reform looks like. So here in Minnesota, that hasn't become an issue. There's been some talk about another detention facility. The state has the right and the ability as a sovereign entity to work in and amongst these agencies. Some of it is dictated to us, but some of it is how we respond. I think it's in our best interest for Minnesota to be a model. We have, per capita wise, we've accepted, as we know, many refugees as opposed to other states. I think we're better for it. I think there has been a tradition of resettling folks, especially in time of conflict or fleeing persecution. We continue to advocate for that. We will continue to build the resources necessary to make sure that people feel welcome, they're part of the community, and then try and change this national narrative, because I truly believe, and you see this, if we can just reach somewhere in there where a comprehensive immigration reform system works better, we take away some of that angst, we start to get out of this, and then we get away from where we're going. I saw there's a new series coming out. I don't know if some of you saw this. Years ago, I taught sociology for a few years, and I remember, I think it came out in 1989. Bill Moyers did a documentary on Beyond Hate, and he had Elie Wiesel, and tried to get at the heart of this. Somebody's doing, why do we hate? Why do we hate one another? What do we do? And a lot of it got to that sense of building community. A lot of these folks feel isolated in their own community, and change is difficult. This bus driver in Worthington said, you know, I used to pick up these kids at the baseball field and take them there. Now I pick up these kids wearing clothes I've never seen and all that. Well, you know, there's people that yell, get off your grass to kids. That's always happened. Get out of my yard, whatever it might be. But we need to help them understand that change is hard. I don't totally dismiss that gentleman in where he's going. I certainly am not going to normalize him spreading fear into children who are escaping persecution, civil war, to try and go to kindergarten in Worthington while their parents are out working 50, 60 hours a week, paying their taxes and doing what they're supposed to do. So I'm hopeful on this one. I think these times of great turmoil well, everybody in this room, and especially look at these young ones, there is going to be an accounting one way or another someday on what we've done. I think we are resilient. I also, though, don't take for granted of how bad things can go very quickly. And I think all of us are clearly aware of that. But I think there is a sense of, that Chinese sense of that in crisis comes opportunity. I think the opportunity here is to reset some of these relationships.
Great. Well, thank you.
Patient. Long day.
So before we totally conclude, I do want to make sure that question about a nonprofit getting involved in policy is clear for everyone. We are not, under the Johnson Amendment, allowed to support a candidate in any way as an institution or as a rabbi at the pulpit. We are not able to do that. That is what separation of church and state means. So that is really clear. Can we get involved in policy? Can we have a policy vision and critique and commitment? Absolutely. Absolutely you can. The line is supporting candidates. People in office can come. They are our representatives. If they couldn't, we'd be really in trouble, right? Once they're in office, then they can come and be a part of us and talk to us. If they're in an election year, you won't see many elected officials here, okay? Because it gets complicated. So they both represent us, but they're in the middle of an election, and we have to be very, very careful during those moments in time. Wanted to just make that really clear, because if that's a question out there, I'm clear. I'm really clear, so you're clear, and we're good. So that's important. Thank you, Governor, very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.